Our speaker tonight is RTB scholar Dr. Doug Keil. Doug holds a PhD in physics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a specialization in plasma physics. After graduate school, he entered the semiconductor industry, where he worked on various applications of plasmas to semiconductor device fabrication. Most of his career was spent at Lam Research Company, where he held senior staff physicist, senior technologist positions. He's authored or co-authored over 20 publications in leading internationally recognized journals and is an inventor on over 23 issued patents. In 2020, he began the master's program in the Christian Apologetics MACA program at Biola University. He's also in the Hebrew master's program at Multnomah University. His passion for science-faith issues began shortly after making a lordship decision in high school. Contact with Campus Crusade for Christ, now Cru, began in high school in West Allis, Wisconsin. As an undergraduate, he was involved in student leadership positions at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His first encounter with RTB began in the late 1990s, which eventually led to helping found the RTB San Jose chapter in the early 2000s. Yes, Doug was one of my predecessors here at Reasons to Believe San Jose chapter. After moving to the Portland, Oregon area, he continued involvement with RTB as career, family, and other life commitments permitted. And at this time, I'm going to unshare my presentation and ask you to welcome Doug Keil.
I am indeed a student in the Christian Apologetics program at Biola. I'm also taking a class at the moment on the topic of the resurrection taught by Sean McDowell, that's Josh McDowell's son. And so I've had reason to spend a lot of time thinking about the resurrection. And honestly, this is probably the first time in my life that I've really wrestled with the fact of just how fundamental the resurrection really is to the Christian faith. I might be slow to figure things out, but I never fully appreciated that until maybe this past year. It is just core to so much of what happened in the New Testament and to the Christian faith. I realize for some of you who are quicker to figure these things out than I am, that probably should be obvious, but it's been amazing for me to be confronted with all of that. So the goal tonight is to try to share with you sort of what I've been learning, also the landscape of ideas, what people have been thinking in this area, and hopefully you'll find that interesting. First, maybe a bit of housekeeping. I plan to leave time at the end, I hope, for questions and comments. So for the sake of trying to get through the material, I guess I'd like to ask if you have questions, which I welcome, to restrict them to basically clarifying questions, if I'm not making sense. And then at the end, we'll try to have more of an exchange if that's needed. So I wanted to basically also emphasize that we're talking in this talk about a real physical resurrection. We're not talking about a concept. We're not talking about people seeing an apparition. We're talking about a physical, embodied resurrection of a person, the person of Jesus. And that's important because in this topic, there is quite a few people who, even Christians, who seem to have trouble with that. And but if in fact you do have trouble with that, if you really have trouble accepting that Jesus physically rose from the dead, you're also in danger of completely demolishing Christianity as a whole. Basically, there is nothing really more central to the Christian faith than a resurrected Jesus. That's made clear in 1 Corinthians 15, I believe. And if you read that verse carefully, I think the critical part of that verse is the part where Paul writes, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins." So you can't escape how core this is to the Christian faith. But that, of course, raises the question, did this really happen? What evidence, how can you build an argument to defend that this is really something that happened? And as a person who spent a lot of time in the sciences, I'm used to being able to measure something or otherwise improve things that way. Here, however, you're dealing with a historical situation, and historical arguments are probably more, they require more thought than perhaps, and it's a different kind of thinking than you would spend on something that's more science related. So the there's a lot to cover tonight, and I wanted to say that I'm actually, for the most part, giving, you could characterize it as a book report. I'm going to be following pretty closely this book, The Case for the Resurrection by Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. And I wanted to do this because it's quite possible that tonight I will raise questions that either I can't answer or we simply don't have time to go into it in depth. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to dig deeper if you find you need to do this. And given the fact that this is so core to the Christian identity, I think, if you have any curiosity at all, by all means pursue them and ask your questions, until you run out of them. So don't be shy in that way. The fascinating thing about the Christian faith is it really opens itself up to interrogation in ways that other faiths, other religions don't. So we're going to be looking at at this issue from an evidence standpoint, not from a faith standpoint, and we'll see how this goes. So, but I have to say that before I do that, there's at least 3 preliminary concepts that I want to cover before we launch into a defense of the resurrection. I believe these concepts are important as background material, and I hope that you'll keep them in the back of your mind as we get into the discussion. The first of these, I believe, is you've got to realize that there's such a thing as the myth of absolute certainty. You hear the phrases such as, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and things like this. You have to realize that we're dealing here tonight with a historical argument. Historical arguments can give you high confidence, but never absolute certainty. There's always the possibility that Lincoln didn't exist. There's the possibility that Alexander the Great was just an invention of things. It's possible that we never landed on the moon. It's possible. It's possible. It's possible. And the issue then is, okay, how do you develop a high confidence level, not absolute proof? We weren't actually physically present in some of these events. And I want you to be comfortable with that. And I want to point out that this is actually, if you think about it, it's not exactly like this is something new. Very little in life can be known with 100% certainty. We make decisions all the time based on partial certainty. So the idea that somehow when we're discussing the Christian faith, you need 100% certainty before you can make a decision is really probably more of an excuse, more of a reason for denial than an actual argument against making a decision for Christ. So I would really want people to think about that. Historical arguments are of this nature, and you can't escape that. I believe tonight will give you reasons for high confidence, but I will also be upfront about the fact that I can't prove this in an axiomatic, deterministic, absolute way. And to even try to claim you can is probably not being intellectually honest. So the second item that I wanted to talk about is the fact that I've just mentioned what I've done. You might be tempted to ask the question, well, why can't we have absolute certainty? Why isn't that God is in fact, well, in some sense, kind of hidden? What is the reason for this ambiguity? I mean, why the kabuki theater? Why does not God just show himself and give us 100% certainty? I think this is an honest question that deserves an answer. And what I would like to suggest to you is that think about what you're asking for. If God were to show up in your bedroom tonight, try to imagine what that would be like. Honestly, you'd be intrigued, you'd be fascinated, but you'd be terrified as well to have, the creator of the universe before you, even if God, of course, is not obviously appearing before you with some sort of intent to harm you, that it would just still be terrifying. I believe that at the end of the day, God, as your creator, wants a relationship with you. And that he wants a relationship that is not based on intimidation. And to do that requires a partial level of hiddenness. And that is, I think, something Christians have to get comfortable with. And I think the analogy that the image, I guess you could say, that I want to leave you with is that I had a daughter. She's now launched. She got married this last September, actually, and she's probably going to start her own family pretty soon. But I remember when she was very little, and I have to say that I really enjoyed it when she decided of her own free will to want to just crawl up in daddy's lap and sit there. And as her dad, I had the power. I had a great deal more power than she had. If I wanted to, I could have easily intimidated her into the kinds of behavior that I might have wanted her to exhibit. But honestly, if you're a serious parent, who is going to want to do that? So I want you to think about that. When God doesn't show up in experiences, I think you have to realize this is often misunderstood as evidence for non-existence, but it's really misunderstanding God's ultimate objectives. So that's item number 2. Now, getting back to the core of the presentation tonight, preliminary number 3 is a really important question. And that is, when can you trust a historical claim? How do you know what you know is the kind of question. I remember when I worked at Lamb, we used to ask questions like that all the time. How do you know what you know? And you really need to grapple with this if you're going to try to tackle a historical argument. The thing that is amazing about going through this exercise is this applies also to so much of other things in life right now. I mean, if you look at the news, how do you know what to believe? I mean, the news media I could be wrong, but it seems like it's more fractured than ever with agendas and who knows what, and it's hard to know what to believe sometimes, depending on which source you're looking at. How do you know if we're succeeding in the Ukraine? How do you know if what Israel's doing in Gaza? These are issues that are not that much different in terms of epistemology than the question of what is the veracity of a report from 2,000 years ago. So I want to offer you 5 principles that are used by historians. There is a fair amount of discussion given in the field of history to this question. This is not something historians haven't thought about. They spend a lot of time worrying about this kind of question. Michael Licona wrote a very amazing book on the historicity of the resurrection, and he spends basically about a quarter of the book just talking about historiography, which is this issue. So there's a lot of things I could offer. I want to restrict myself to at least 5, and you could probably add to this list. But I think that number 1 on the list is that we want to have, if we can, multiple independent sourcing. Think about trying to figure out what's true in the news media. You probably would do well to listen to some source that is perceived to be from the far liberal left and from the far conservative right, and anything you can find in the middle and put it together. It is best to kind of look at multiple sources to figure out what truth is. My humble opinion is one of the reasons why, for instance, there's so much strong opinion, shall we say, regarding what's happening now in the Middle East is partly because people are following only certain sources and really not willing to listen to anything else. So multiple sourcing. The second item is sources hostile to a claim but yet affirming are more likely to be trustworthy. So the example I'd want to give there is if Putin, for instance, gets on TV and says, we're losing a lot of tanks in the Ukraine, are you likely to believe him or not? And the argument here is that he would be a hostile source in some sense to the success of a military effort in the Ukraine by the Ukrainians. So if he's even admitting success on the part of the Ukrainian army, then you might be more prone to accept what he's being saying as likely truth. So the third item would be, is the item you're trying to assess consistent with the principle of embarrassment? Basically, if people are inventing a story, they're really not likely to include details that kind of don't really support the story. Usually, real reports are kind of messy, and they include things that it's like, well, that doesn't support your case. But if they're being honest in reporting it, those elements will be present. Basically, there are items that well, I'm sort of repeating myself here, but basically details that are embarrassing to the case. Of course, 4 is sort of kind of obvious. Eyewitness testimony is preferred, recognizing, of course, that multiple observers may have a different view of the incident and therefore a slightly different take on it. But nevertheless, the closer that an eyewitness is in terms of time and position, that also is desired in terms of what it is you would take as truth. And 5 is kind of an expansion of the same idea. Sources that are early and close to the event are preferred. So 4 and 5 are very closely attached. So we're going to kind of rely on these things. And the book that I just quoted does rely on those kind of things to try to assess historical sources that we do have, both within the Bible and outside of the Bible, that bear on the question of whether or not Jesus really did rise from the dead. So we will go on from there. I'm also wanting to mention one other item regarding historiography here, and that is that we really have to keep these rules in mind, partly because there is no such thing as the perfect historical source. I want to make that clear as well. If a historian tries to restrict himself to some sort of text or a source that is truly free of perhaps bias, almost every historian ever throughout history, even to the present, usually writes with an agenda, even if they don't admit it or not. So if you try to find information that doesn't have an agenda behind it, if it doesn't have mistakes in it, if it doesn't have problems with plausibility, then you're probably going to know nothing about history. If you insist on a perfect source, you're basically not going to be able to know anything about history. So understanding history is usually an exercise of taking imperfect sources and making the best sense to try to fit to a number of sources the best model of what really happened, given the fact that each one, is going to have problems of one sort or another. And that's what makes historians rather busy. So with those ideas in mind, I wanted to say that what we're going to use is something called the minimal facts tactic. This should be distinguished. This is what I'm talking about now is sort of the general sort of meta strategy for how you might defend the resurrection. I want to set this in context to what you might call the maximal facts tactic. The maximal facts tactic, or maybe a kind of top-down approach, is probably the one that most of you grew up with or encountered first. And basically, this is where you try to defend the resurrection by first defending the existence of God, then perhaps defending the existence of the Bible as inerrant, truthful, and inspired message of God, free of errors, contradictions. And if you succeed in doing all of that, then of course the message of the resurrection just kind of falls out naturally. But this is a respectable thing to do. I have to say that my first coming to believe in the resurrection was probably through a process like that, through realizing that the Bible was really true, and therefore the message it said was really true, and the resurrection was part of that. But that would be also what we want to call the maximal facts approach. There are very respectable scholars. There's a famous one called Lydia McGrew, who's written quite quite a bit recently who do take this approach. And but the challenge tonight that I want to point out is that this approach really requires a person to assume an enormous burden of proof. You've got a lot of things, a lot of ducks that you got to get in a row before you might be able to even begin to move a skeptic towards considering the claims of Christ if they're just, I'm speaking strictly from an intellectual perspective. Of course, I acknowledge that God works in ways that we often don't know, and God's Spirit, we at the end of the day, it's God that brings us to the Lord, not to Himself, not our wonderful argument. But we have a responsibility to present the best case we can, and I do think that it's if you're dealing with a skeptic, and especially if you've got limited time, you're meeting for him for coffee or something, going through an entire defense of all of the things I just mentioned is going to be an awful big task. And Lord bless you if you succeed with that, but I could easily imagine skeptics having a very hard time with that. So this then brings us to an alternate approach, which is one I want to focus on tonight. This is called the minimal facts approach. And it's important to understand how this logic works because it really makes life a lot easier. And I think it's amazingly persuasive, but you'll have to make that judgment tonight for yourself. The idea here is that you don't begin with inerrancy. You don't even begin with the existence of God. You basically treat the text as any other ancient source. Basically, the Bible is just as veridical as Tacitus or Josephus or Suetonius, and you basically use it as yet another ancient source, which it is. It really is an ancient document that has historical basis, and you line what's said up with others, and try to draw from this the most reasonable explanation. Try to draw from this a set of bedrock facts that require an explanation. So this idea of trying to well, let me just say that basically the bottom line here is that we're trying to assume that the biblical record is just another ancient document. We're trying to use secular historical criteria for establishing the historicity of a particular fact. And then we're going to want to identify in the historical data what facts that we can that really are pretty bedrock, that almost everybody is going to agree on. And then once you've established that list of historically grounded facts, then you want to ask the question, what actually best explains those facts? This helps us to avoid the complication of defending inerrancy and divine inspiration. It also tends to help us avoid the counter argument of, well, you want to defend the resurrection from the Bible, while you're just sort of defending the Bible with using the Bible, which isn't entirely true, but it's a claim that is often made by skeptics, and you really kind of want to not get distracted by that. So how do we define what would be a minimal set of facts? Well, we're going to try to define those facts. We're going to look for those facts that are strongly evidenced. And then this is critical. We're going to be looking for facts that are granted by either more than 75% and usually more than 90% of scholars, both secular and Christian, who have looked at this issue in some depth. So we're going to count noses, admittedly, but because we're not historians ourselves, and we're going to ask the question, are these facts that most scholars, including those that are deeply skeptical of Christianity, would accept as true? This is important because you're basically arguing already from a position of strength. If you are discussing any issue with somebody and you start out with several beginning assumptions that your interlocutor really agrees with you with, you've just minimized your burden of persuasion considerably. So, but I do want to make it clear that I don't personally reject God's existence. I don't personally reject inerrancy or divine inspiration. I actually personally believe in these things. I just want to say, what if we take the sort of methodological position of not going there and using a more secular historical perspective? How far can we get with that in terms of defending the resurrection? And that is, hopefully I haven't. There's a quick comment here. This is another argument for why I think the minimal facts might be the thing to do these days. Barna Research had a survey of teenagers they recently published. About 50%, I believe this was mostly Christian teenagers, about 50% of them, only 50%, which is sort of shocking, believe that the Bible is the Word of God. But the thing I really want to point you to is that, even within the Christian teen world, only about 11% think it's inspired, and only 12% think it's inspired but has no errors. And another 11, it's, even within the church, there's a lot of people who have a deep skepticism, within our own family, if you will, regarding the ideas of inerrancy. So if you wanted to argue for the resurrection on the basis of that, you really do have a hill to climb. So the history, the minimal facts tactic is basically mostly attributed to the work of one person. That would be Gary Robert Habermas. And there's some fascinating history, at least I think it's interesting. Gary was a Christian who was a history student he was a graduate student at Michigan State University. And he went through a season of very serious doubt. He began to wonder, well, okay, fine. What reason do I really have to think that this Christian faith is true? And he really struggled with this. And he decided to do his PhD thesis on the question of the resurrection, which was kind of, if you think about it, this was a secular history department, quite a few, and if you think of anything in a secular history department, there are going to be a lot of people very skeptical of anything Christian. So it was kind of audacious for him to even suggest this, but this is what he did. And he did this, frankly, for personal reasons. He wanted to know himself if he could do this. And so not only did he have a skeptical audience, but he himself was struggling with doubts when he did this. So honestly, this is an amazing story, I feel. But basically, he realized that if he wanted to make progress on this, he had to first identify any core bedrock facts about the resurrection that basically the majority of all scholars, including his PhD review committee, would agree on. And it turns out those things do exist. Even if you're a skeptical, atheistic historian, there are things about the early Christian world that they all acknowledge. And we're going to go through those a few tonight. And in the process of looking at thousands of pages of literature, I think there's one source that I have that he went through about 3,000 scholarly publications on this topic. And he basically counted noses and figured out which facts were basically attested to by at least 90%, and in some cases 70% or more. But most of them were more than 90%. And for the sake of his dissertation, he came up with about 12 facts that he felt fell in this category. Then, of course, once he had this, the next question he asked is, what explains all of these facts? And I really want to be clear that you got to pay attention to the logic of this sort of way of doing things. This wasn't throwing stones in a pan. And then, whichever pan is heaviest, he wanted to explain all of those core bedrock. He wanted a model that would explain all of those core bedrock facts. This is in electrical engineering, this would be something akin to and logic. All of the lights have to go on before the final light goes on, kind of thing. And that is very different. To sort of try to drive this issue home, I want to tell quickly a story. When I was in junior high school, there was a convenience store next to my school, and they sold a lot of candy there, frankly, sort of smart. They were near a bunch of kids. And of course, my mom never wanted me to go there because that was way too much sugar. So Now, suppose I was accused of the crime of buying gumdrops at this store, and the evidence against me were the following. The store is a very short walk from school, which is true. I had time to go to the store before I had to take the bus home. I had money to buy the gumdrops, and there was an eyewitness who saw me in the store. Am I guilty of the crime? So basically, we're looking again for each one of these facts. The thing is, each one of these facts in isolation could be explained. Well, sure, the store was a very short walk from home, but my feet were sore that day and I didn't want to. Or, the bus really does leave pretty quickly. I don't know if I could take time to go buy anything before the bus leaves. Each one of these four as an individual claim could be shot down probably, but the question really is not, are each of these individually true? The question is, what explains all four? You might find an explanation for any one of these, but you need to find something with all four. You need to explain them simultaneously. And that is critical to the argument that we're going to present tonight. We want to identify a set of facts that are core, and we need to find an explanation that explains all of them. Each individual one might be on its own rather weak, or in some cases, not as strong as you might like, but we want to find something that explains them all if we've established that they are, in fact, bedrock facts. I suppose lawyers in courtroom have similar kinds of problems when they're trying to prove their case. So there are basically 5 minimally accepted facts that we're going to talk about tonight. This is the list that I have on the screen. Hopefully you're seeing that. Those 5 are the ones that are accepted by, well, I give in parentheses the percentage of scholars according to the study by Habermas, and I give the reference to that study in the link or in the footnote there. But these are 5 things that most historians, even the highly skeptical ones, will grant you. One of them is that Jesus was a historical person who died by crucifixion. Now, that's not saying he's God. That's not saying anything much beyond that. It's just simply saying that, yep, there was somebody who lived, his name was Jesus, and they killed him by crucifixion. That's all that first item is saying. 2, Jesus' disciples truly believed that he arose from the dead and appeared to them. Now, that again is not saying that that really happened. It's saying that the disciples sincerely believed that he rose from the dead, that they had that impression. 3, Paul, initially an enemy of the church, was suddenly changed. Now, what does that prove? Well, that's what we're going to try to get into. But for the most part, that statement by its lonesome maybe doesn't prove that much. Okay, he had an experience and he was changed. Similarly, James, the brother of Jesus, remember, if you read your Gospels carefully, the brothers and sisters, and Jesus did have brothers and sisters, basically thought their sibling was completely bonkers, nuts. In fact, in one point in the New Testament, I'm forgetting the verse, but they basically tried to. There was one incident where they tried to sort of shepherd Jesus out of the scene because they thought he was just completely a lunatic. His own family didn't really believe that he was who he claimed he was. So, but then later, James, very skeptical, was suddenly changed. What does that mean? The tomb of Jesus also was found empty. Again, by itself, what does that prove? Well, alone, maybe that's not proving much. But again, we're going to consider what is explaining all of these facts. So is everybody with me so far? Do I need to pause for any kind of clarification? All right, well, I'll keep going. Hopefully I'm not going to try to burn too much time here yet. But there's a lot that goes into defending these minimal facts. I'm mostly relying on the fact that most historians accept them. I'm going to try to quickly go through some reasons why they might accept them. It probably won't be satisfying to some of you. That's why I give you the book. So let me try to very quickly give you a flyby of what the reasons are why these 5 facts are accepted, knowing, of course, that you may have questions that may require some deeper detail. So Jesus being a historical person. Well, we have at least 8 extra biblical sources that discuss Jesus within 150 years of his death. He's discussed in Josephus. He's discussed in Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Philologian of Tralles, Suetonius, Lucian, Celsus, and even the Jewish Talmud. And many of the sources were not particularly friendly to Christianity. All four Gospels, of course, record Jesus' death. And basically, even the Skeptical Jesus Seminar, which is famous for not believing much of the New Testament, one of the leaders of that was John Dominic Crossan, and he said that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. The other fact two, is that Paul claimed he rose, the disciples believe, I should say, that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. Now, we are not making a statement that this is true or false. We're just simply noting the fact that they believe they saw Jesus. Paul claimed he rose from the dead. The writings of Paul are clear on that. There's also very early oral tradition. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5, that many believe is in fact actually a recounting of a creed that predates any of the writings of the New Testament, basically. And that is attesting to the resurrection. There's other oral summaries that we have records of, some of which are in the Gospels themselves, embedded within the text of the Gospel that attest to this. So we have also written tradition. We have Clement, Bishop of Rome. We have Polycarp, who mentioned these things. So about 9 sources, not all of which are from the Bible. So I do want to say that regarding this fact, virtually all the disciples died for their belief, one way or the other. There is some debate about which ones may have not died they were all certainly persecuted for their belief. There's a few that may have not actually died. I probably should update this slide, actually. But there are, most of the disciples were in one way or another punished, often to death, for their views. And basically, critical scholars like Rudolf Bultmann agree with that. Gert Ludemann is a very committed atheist who is not very friendly, is a very good New Testament scholar in the sense of knowledge. But anyway, he says that it may take, and he's respected, I should say, in New Testament circles, even though he comes from a very atheistic perspective. I should maybe put it that way. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death, in which they perceived Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Paula Fredrickson is also an atheist, and she says, I don't know what they saw, but I do know that as a historian, they must have seen something. Fact 3, Paul, an enemy of the church, was suddenly changed. We know that his belief was so strong that he was willing to accept years of suffering. And eventually, we do have very good historical reason to think that he was martyred for the gospel. And his pre-conversion hostility, I think most of you, if you're familiar with the New Testament at all, is pretty clear. The life of Paul does have documentation outside of the New Testament. There are comments about him written by Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Tertullian, Dionysius of Corinth, and even Origen. So these are some of the early New Testament fathers. Fact 4, the skeptic James, brother Jesus, was changed. Gospels report that at least 4 brothers, and he had a bunch of unnamed sisters. Before the resurrection, James was apparently a very pious Jew who thought his brother was nuts. That's given to us in Mark 3:21. James claimed to have seen the risen Jesus and became a leader afterwards in the Jerusalem church. What would cause a person so committed to Jesus' insanity to suddenly believe he was in fact the God and the creator of the universe, basically? Pretty amazing change. The tomb was found empty. Of course, if the resurrection didn't happen, all you got to do is show that there was a body in the tomb. That would pretty much end the discussion. And that doesn't seem to have happened. We have good reason to think the tomb of Jesus was under Roman guard, under penalty of death. And the interesting thing is the people who had no interest in supporting the resurrection, namely the Jewish leaders and others, they could have easily pointed to an occupied tomb if they wanted to make their case that Jesus had not raised from the dead. And they never tried to go there. They often made other excuses for why people were claiming Jesus was raised from the dead. The first testimony of the resurrection was actually from women. Well, which in Old Testament times, I realize, we're not talking about modern times, and I'm not saying that I would endorse this, but in Old Testament times, the testimony of women was not considered valuable at all, was garbage, basically. And in law courts, it was not admissible. So for God, it's amazing how countercultural God was. The very people who shouldn't really be taken seriously are the ones who were there first at the resurrection of Jesus, giving the first testimony of his resurrection. It's kind of, I suppose in some sense, God thumbing his nose at the leaders of that day. So, but this also is in alignment with this principle of embarrassment that I tried to mention earlier. If you were trying to make the story up, you would have more credible, if you will, witnesses telling the story. And you don't see that in the New Testament. So again, we need to find a model, a theory that explains all of these facts. Explaining each one is not enough. I'm sort of probably harping on that maybe too much. But I do want to mention too that this is not a God of the gaps argument. The form of this logic is really an inference to the best explanation. We're looking for the best explanation that fits with all the facts. So let's think for a minute, what could those explanations be? So historically, and I'm giving you a short list, there's probably a longer one, but maybe you guys are more creative than me, but here's are some of all the explanations one could come up with to explain the minimal facts that we've just tried to lay out. One of them was the resurrection was a legend or a myth. Well, the story told by the disciples didn't change with time. Who will die for something they know is a myth? It's people surprisingly will die for something that is in fact later shown to be false, but people usually don't deliberately choose to die for something they know is not true. It's really hard to get a person to do that. The earliest critics responded to the resurrection as basically a historical event. All right, what about the disciples stole the body? This is in fact the in the New Testament. This is the argument given by the Jewish leaders actually. So this is probably one of the earliest arguments given to try to give an explanation for the reported resurrection of Jesus. Well, okay. The problem with that is think about what you need to do to support a conspiracy. Few can endure imprisonment, suffering, and martyrdom for a lie, which is what you'd have to do in this case. Also, group conspiracies are really hard to sustain. Usually, somebody breaks and things fall apart. I mean, if you're gonna, I'm tempted to give a political example at this moment, but maybe I should refrain from doing that. There's obviously some examples in the news today where this is happening for us in real time. But anyway, the point I think is clear that it's really hard to sustain a conspiracy when, in fact, the event is actually not true. Okay, the other one is it was all a big hoax. Jesus just escaped. He snuck out of the place, and well, that's why we have this report of a resurrection. Well, the problem is that no ancient source defends this option. You'd need to have, again, a very elaborate hoax, and that would be very difficult to maintain. This is historians in all of these cases, these models I'm giving you. There's extended, long discussion discussing this. I'm just giving you a quick flyby, and if you wanted to dig into these arguments deeper, I can point you at the end of this talk to some really great resources. But so I'm just simply saying that most historians don't think this is at all a credible idea, that it was just a hoax. There was too much that happened that was that could be you'd have to sustain an elaborate hoax that basically be very hard to sustain. The women went to the wrong tomb. In other words, the women were, they're women, right? So in those days, everybody thought women were simply, I certainly don't believe. I have great respect for our sisters, but there are in those times people didn't, and women were ditzy people who just get confused, and they just went to the wrong tomb. They didn't know what they were doing. Well, I'm sorry, folks, but Jerusalem was not a big place. There were plenty of people who could identify the right tomb. I don't know if you've ever been to Israel. I haven't yet been able to, but everybody I've ever talked to who's been there, the old city is not a big place. And followers were convinced basically by his appearances. There were plenty of people who could point the women or anybody else to the right tomb. Jesus was buried in some other tomb. Well, Joseph of Arimathea was not exactly an unknown person. His burial place was well known. No ancient source defends this or even attempts to make this argument. This is a very modern argument, and it's just simply very unsustainable from a modern from the ancient sources we have. This number 6 actually is a very actively debated explanation for the resurrection. Jesus appeared as hallucinations to people. This is, if you go into atheist circles or skeptical circles, you might hear this a lot. For whatever reason, it's very popular now. The problem with this is that hallucinations have never ever been collective experiences. For this argument to fly, you'd have to have people simultaneously experiencing the same hallucination. Medical science has looked at hallucinations pretty thoroughly. And sure, hallucinations existed. People in Old Testament times did hallucinate for various reasons. This is something a human mind is perfectly capable of doing in any century. But what is not possible is for you to have the same hallucination as the guy sitting next to you or standing next to you. No evidence for group or induced hallucinations has ever been demonstrated in the psychological literature. 7 is also a recently invented model that people do talk about. And that's the idea that Jesus basically didn't really fully die. He just swooned, meaning he came near death, and then in the cool of the tomb, he revived. And then he basically, after being scourged, and remember, scourging with the cat of nine tails the Romans used, pretty much, gave you deep wounds, probably down to the bone. And after being on a cross with nails driven through your hands and feet, and we do have evidence that that is, in fact, indeed what people did. There's solid archaeological evidence that crucifixions were done that way. Apparently, Jesus woke up and then had enough strength to move a several-ton stone and walked out, and I guess went to the local pub and had a drink or something. The physical state of Jesus was simply terrible, and there is no real way that you could convincingly argue that he had the strength to do that. The other thing is that, Jesus would show up to the disciples and think about his physical condition. He's near death, and he gets to the door where the disciples are meeting, and he knocks on the door, and they open the door, and he shouts, "I am risen." Of course, then he keels over, from fainting or something. It would not be a convincing scene, given how beaten up Jesus was, if this was a naturalistic event. There's also a twin theory. This is popular in Muslim circles, surprisingly, that Jesus actually had a twin, and that it was a twin that was crucified. Very popular, again, as I said, in Muslim circles. Well, again, this requires a difficult to maintain conspiracy. The disciples spent 3 years with this guy, very intimate time with this guy, and they would have known whether, if you spend any time with twins, you can figure it may take you some time, but eventually you can know who's who. And if it was the case, and there's no historical evidence that Jesus had a twin, but if it was the case, it's really hard to believe that the disciples would not have been able to distinguish who was who. And again, they would have died. They would have been persecuted for a lie, if in fact that was the case. So the other then is that in number 9, which is defended still today, is that the resurrection actually wasn't physical, it was spiritual. That we're misreading the entire New Testament, and actually what happened was that we shouldn't read it as a physical event. We should read it as as God's, message breaking in on the world or something. And well, of course, Jesus said, "A spirit does not have flesh and bones. You see that I have." The thing I love about Christianity is it invites you to be critical thinking and ask questions and ask for evidence. And even in the New Testament, people did that. Honestly, one of my heroes is Thomas. I know that's probably not cool in some circles, but I have to say that I really admired Thomas. Show me the wound. I want to put my fingers in the side. Of course, when he actually had the opportunity and realized who Jesus was, he didn't do that. He was just blown over by the realization that here before him was the living creator of the universe, risen from the dead. So the 10th explanation is Jesus actually rose from the dead. And that is, of course, the conclusion that many would prefer to avoid. And they prefer to avoid that because it does suggest that you have to submit your life to something, basically the creator of the universe. And that can be a hard decision for some people. So, when I worked at Lamb Research, we used to do these things called stoplight diagrams. And here is my version of a stoplight diagram. In engineering, very often you've got to consider possible options, and you want to consider the pros and cons of that. So I have a list on the left of the possible explanations, and then I want to show you that here are the kind of, and I urge you to consider maybe making yourself a blank version of this and filling it out for yourself. I then want you to consider the question, well, let's go through all this list. Which one of these core bedrock facts, and there was 5 of them, died by crucifixion, the disciples believed, Paul believed, James believed, and there was an empty tomb. You've got to explain all 5 of those. So how do the 10 explanations I went through explain those? Does it do a good job? Well, here is my assessment of that, and I urge you to do your own. But in a few cases, yeah, some of the core facts could be explained. For instance, I think that the disciples stole the body. Well, that would explain an empty tomb. It was all a big hoax. Well, again, that could explain an empty tomb, but it really doesn't explain the other core bedrock facts that we've identified. The only thing that explains all 5 is the claim that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And that, folks, is the core of the argument that I wanted to present to you tonight. And I urge you to think through this. Even if you're a committed Christian, it's worthwhile to think through this because you may indeed be called on to try to defend your belief in that. So then if, in fact, there is this situation where many even secular scholars have an argument, if they're willing to accept it, for the resurrection, why don't they? Well, I want to sort of close or get near the end of this talk with the fact that the primary reason at the end of the day why the resurrection is rejected, in my view, is the challenge of naturalism. Secular historians believe that they have to maintain the ideas or maintain arguments that are within a materialist paradigm. You really can't, by assumption, consider the miraculous because that's just simply out of bounds. Well, of course, what you're doing then is reaching a conclusion by presupposition. You're not reaching the conclusion on the basis of evidence or argument. You're reaching a conclusion by presumption. And that, of course, if you are pausing to think about it, I think most people realize is a bad way to reason. At the end of the day, a naturalistic argument against the resurrection is an argument by assumption. Miracles don't happen, period, end of day, we're done with the discussion. So it's important in this discussion to learn to be sensitive to assumptions. In fact, if you're dealing with a skeptic, it's probably a good idea to respectfully and kindly ask him, well, what are your assumptions on how you analyze these things, and what is your reason for having those assumptions? Very often people don't realize they're making these assumptions. One of the things I want to leave you with is that the idea that miracles don't happen is actually not easily supported in some sense. I want to argue that, let's suppose we stay within a naturalistic paradigm. Even modern physics, the area that I spent my PhD on when I got it, and also, worked in a company using applied physics, staying within physics, let's see what you can determine from that. Well, modern physics actually strongly suggests that transcendent reality actually does exist. This, of course, if you read any of RTB materials, Hugh Ross's materials, you end up with lots more argument for this case than I'm going to be able to give you here. But let me just simply say that modern physical cosmology points to a creation from physical nothingness. There was a singularity in the beginning from which all things came. Before that, space and time itself did not exist. So how can that be if, in fact, the material world is all there is and all there would be? There was essentially a miracle event that occurred at the moment of the creation of the world, by any reasonable definition of miracle, that we now can defend from simply modern physical cosmology, in my estimation. There's also the issue of fine tuning. Where does that come from? And the problem of information in DNA, and of course, no viable naturalistic explanations explain the origin of life. All of these things, in some sense, could be argued to be, depending on your definition of miracle, and that's an important question to answer, could be regarded as miraculous. So I just really quickly want to leave you with four things. Okay, so let's suppose you accept that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, you could ask the question, fine, lovely, so what? Why should I care? It's an interesting footnote in history. Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, that's very strange, very miraculous, but really, what does it matter to me? And I want to suggest to you 4 points why it should be something that matters to you. God wants a restored relationship with you. We're told in the Bible that we were once alienated from God and enemies in some sense. I'm quoting here Colossians, or paraphrasing it, but that God wants to restore a relationship with you that was broken. If you read the story, read the book of Genesis. Point 2 is that our moral state, however, the word which is described by the word sin, prevents that restored relationship with God. It's interesting that in both Greek and in Hebrew, the word sin is a word that typically suggests the work of an archer. In Hebrew, it would be, hamartia is the word in Greek, and kata is the word in Hebrew, and they both are archery terms. You're missing the bullseye. It's not so much that you rob banks and so on. My wife is Chinese, and in Chinese, the word for sin is the word zui, which means that you're a criminal. You rob banks and shoot people and take money from widows and things like that. But that's not what the word sin means in the Bible. It means you have an attitude of, God, I really don't give a rat's behind whether you exist or not. I want to live my own life. Point 3, the death of Jesus. In the death of Jesus, there's provision for a moral state, sin. And there's not time to explain why that is or how that works. That's a big area of theology, but just it's sufficient for the purposes of this conversation. Simply say that it's the death of Jesus that gives the provision for the payment. You do the crime, someone's got to do the time for our state of sin. The resurrection is proof that this provision is complete and it's available to us. God demonstrates his own love for us, and that while we're yet sinners, Christ died for us. The last point, which I really think is, I'm a little bit frustrated sometimes with how the gospel presentation is made in many evangelical churches. I think this point 4 really can't be forgotten. People need to make a personal, individual decision to accept the provision of sin that Jesus offers. It's not just enough to say God and Jesus paid for sin, and Jesus was such a wonderful person, but you need to make a choice. It's got to be a personal choice. It's not enough to just say Jesus was a wonderful person, and you've got to think about the fact that you have to make a choice. And I think sometimes in church gospel presentation, this point is not emphasized enough. You've got to make a choice. So I'm worried about time here, so maybe I need to just simply say that is the defense of the resurrection in a nutshell, and there are probably many questions that you might have. I wasn't trying to avoid them, but we only had finite time. There are some materials that I just want to quick mention. With regard to the gospel, I've given you a QR code here of some wonderful resources. There's an app called God Tools that gives a more in-depth explanation of the gospel. And if you're a Christian who is interested in sharing your faith, that can be a very helpful tool to have in on your phone to guide you through a gospel presentation. Because usually, when you're in these situations, your mind kind of goes blank and you don't know what to say. And this might be a helpful thing to have. The other thing is that regarding digging deeper into the issue of the resurrection, I wanted to recommend something called Zangmeister videos. There's two links here. I gave you the QR codes here for both of those two. There's a part one and a part two. In this case, they are using a minimal facts approach. The minimal facts approach, by the way, is really popular right now. Most people who are trying to defend the resurrection are taking, if you go on YouTube, most of them are taking one version or another of a minimal facts approach. In this case, Zangmeister is using three minimal facts and trying to use that to defend the resurrection. I urge you to look at these videos and see if you yourself find them persuasive, and you'd have for yourself a tool to show in a very entertaining, engaging way, I might say, with someone that you want to talk to about the resurrection, perhaps if you're a grandparent, maybe grandkids or a skeptical friend that you're in good terms with. I also recommend Googling Gary Habermas. If you do that, you're going to get tons of debates and materials. Elisa Childress has a wonderful interview with Gary Habermas. Michael Licona has debated Bart Ehrman on this issue. That's a very enlightening debate. And this is not a fake debate. Bart Ehrman is very hostile to Christianity. He's also very, very knowledgeable, and he asks very tough questions that in fact, sometimes you wonder, okay, Mike, let's give an answer. Anyway, it's not a fake debate. It's really a really good back and forth. Of course, there's Gary Habermas's website. There's two books. I had to read these for my resurrection class at Biola. They're massive books, and honestly, one of the problems with being interested in this area is that you end up with a ton of reading. I've probably plowed through, just for my class alone, maybe more than 2,000 pages of reading. But these are amazing books. Michael Licona is probably, if you really are not satisfied with the depth in the first book I recommended, this book ought to do it for you. This is an amazingly in-depth, 611 pages, treatment of the historiography and the identification of these minimal facts. N.T. Wright is also famous in this area, and he wrote a very, very influential book. He does not really take an explicit minimal facts approach, but in many ways it kind of is. He's usually more concerned with identifying the network of ideas that existed in the ancient world and showing how very bizarre it was for people to claim a physical resurrection. That was just not part of ancient thinking. And in many of the ideas that are presented in the Gospels of the resurrection of Jesus are so ridiculously countercultural, so out of the blue. And Wright shows us very persuasively that you just have to ask the question, what on earth would cause people to come up with this if, in fact, Jesus really wasn't raised from the dead? But I have to say that the books I'm recommending, especially the one that I mentioned at the beginning, are excellent. And, I'm happy to share my presentation, but I really also urge you to think about one of those books.
Well, I have a question.
Go ahead. This list is Lothar Kleiner.
Yes. I recently came up with another interesting series called Cold Case Christianity. And it's very entertaining because it's got a version that he proves the resurrection due to evidence that a detective would look for. What do you think about those presentations if you've seen them?
I actually have seen there's the book that was written by, oh gosh, this is embarrassing. The name is somehow dropped out of memory.
I think his last name is Wallace.
Warner
Yeah,
Wallace.
right, Wallace, right. And he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity, I believe. And some years ago, it's been out now for at least 10 years, and I think I've read it a while back. But Cold case, and I actually met him even at a conference one time. So it's a very, in terms of a book intended for a general audience that are, not historians. It's actually very well done, and I have no issues with what he's saying. And if you think about it, some of what he's saying, what a detective has to do, if you think about it, is similar to a minimal facts approach. For a detective to make his case, he has to establish a few core facts that are only explained by a person being either guilty or not guilty. And I think in some way he's doing a very creative and entertaining and useful version of a minimal facts argument, and just not being very explicit about it. But I think people would do well I would definitely endorse what I'm aware of, at least, of his material. If you're a
Thank you.
professional historian, you might be skeptical. He has lots of cartoons and it's very entertaining. And sometimes, people who are quote scholarly might be turned off by cartoons and such like that. But that's how it is.
I've only listened to the YouTube videos, and those
Yeah.
were quite entertaining.
So Ron Martin has his hand up for a while.
Okay,
Yeah.
Ron, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, I'm thinking that some of these arguments could also be used to argue that UFOs are genuine things or unidentified aerial phenomena, particularly the one about group hallucinations, which are just never experienced, and people who don't have a stake in the opposite. Evidence that they present is credible. And maybe that's, if we argue not only that Jesus rose, but there's genuinely real unidentified aerial phenomena, that might open the doors to people realizing there's a spiritual realm. And maybe the reason why Operation Blue Book was abandoned, which was a project to try to explain all these observations on the basis of naturalistic explanations, was because they just couldn't explain them on the basis of natural explanations. They were otherworldly.
Yeah. Well, the principles of how do you know what you know do apply to other things. And yes, I would agree that the question of UFOs could be also, you don't have to address the same thing. Is there multi-sourcing? Do people maintain credible conspiracies? And I think the balance of the evidence is mostly no, that there's quite a few UFO reports. I mean, I'm not an expert in this area. I think I might direct you actually to a book by Hugh Ross, Little Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, I think. And his take on that is that if you look at these reports, they do tend to have issues, that they're not as well instantiated as perhaps some other historical events. So there might be some issues with that. I think in the book Little Green Men, well, the Hugh Ross book, some of you might be familiar with it. His take is that the majority of the UFO experiences can be explained, but there are residual UFOs that really resist any kind of explanation. And his take is that those are evidence of well, kind of what you just said. It's evidence of a spiritual reality. There are things like the Drake equation that sort of almost, if you think about what that equation means, and you think about the basic physics of interstellar travel, it's really, really hard to take seriously the idea that someone's going to come all the way here from the other part of the galaxy, unless they manage to somehow warp time and space and so on, which by our present understanding of the physics of relativity, it's just not, the ability to warp space like that and travel across galaxies is just not likely. The energies that you need are just so ridiculous that there's just not, it's not plausible.
I wonder if you could apply I mean, I'm not asking you to do it now, but if the minimal facts method could be applied to try to determine whether or not UFOs make sense.
Yeah, I think the question being raised here is a valid one in the sense that you do need to test to see whether or not your reasoning is correct,
Mhm.
method of reasoning. And if that's the point of the question, that much I certainly would agree with. I would think that the book I point people to the book by Hugh Ross because I think he's successful. I read the book many years ago, so I'm probably recalling things from a dim memory, but I think he does, in fact, argue pretty persuasively that the facts that we can establish, it's going to be pretty hard to justify them using the explanation that people came from other worlds. I mean, just issues like the Drake equation, issues like the physics of space travel, you've got to account for those too as your minimal facts. And the explanation is that we're visited by extraterrestrials is going to be hard to sustain as a rational
I'm
explanation.
not suggesting that. I wouldn't explain it that way. I'd explain it as demonic activity and illustrating a spiritual realm. It could be
Okay.
a step in evangelism to get a skeptic to accept that there is a spiritual realm with evidences that people are seeing today.
Yeah.
So, resurrection could be part of that spiritual realm.
Well, Hugh Ross in the book I just mentioned, in fact, does try to do what you just suggested. He tries to suggest that those residual UFO explanations that resist any explanation are best explained by a spiritual realm. So I would, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, I believe, is the name of the book, and I
I've
would
heard about
recommend that.
it.
So, um, so in that sense, Ron, I'm not. There we go. Proof that I'm not lying to you. Kirby's holding the book up. Um, but in that sense, Ron, I think you might be onto something.
John, you had your hand up. Why don't you go ahead?
Yes, I do. Yeah, very nice talk, Doug. Very good. And thanks for using Gary Habermas' minimal facts theory. I think he came to Silicon Valley and gave a presentation in one of the churches here many years ago. I think some of us had a privilege of going and hearing from him. And he's a very convincing person. So I really appreciate that, your summary of it. Now, as you were going through the talk, I just thought of Jesus uh, was crucified. The primary event that caused the Pharisees to do that was his resurrection of Lazarus. Only a week ago, before his own resurrection, and the scripture doesn't go into a lot of it, but I was just reflecting upon the fact that Lazarus must have been alive when Jesus was crucified himself. And and no one argued against that fact. Of course, he was resurrected as a ordinary man. And so the evidence is there. So there's no denying of that. And for that, Jesus was crucified. That was the catalyst. And I would think that would be a powerful um, fact to say that it is possible, but that was a miracle. And anyway, that's the point there. And let me see. There was a third point. Was that let me see here. That just escaped my mind. I'll come back a little bit later. But anyway, I wonder if you can comment on that. In all your reading, has anyone, used that as a argument against those people that it's impossible to be resurrected from death?
Well, if I'm understanding your question well enough, remember in the New Testament, even there was the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and one of the distinctions between them is that there was, and I'm forgetting at this moment who was who, but I think it was the Pharisees that believed the resurrection was going to happen, and there was the Sadducees that denied the resurrection. And there
I
may
think
have been,
that's correct.
and I think there was also N.T. Wright has an amazing discussion of the history of that, and there was in fact some political implications of that. If you believe that you're going to get raised from the dead, then you're more likely to be willing to be an insurrectionist and rebel against the Romans. Because if you get killed, you're going to get raised anyway. And if you're a person who doesn't really want to see a conflict with Rome, you might want to deny the resurrection of any kind. I mean, not just Jesus' resurrection, but in end of times, for instance, because you're just encouraging people to be courageous in their revolt. That's a point I got out of N.T. Wright's book. So I'm not sure if I fully understand your question, but there is discussion about the views that people held about the life after death and how that influenced their political and
Yeah.
other beliefs at the time. I don't know
Yeah,
does that help at all?
Yeah, it's sort of a semi-question. It's a comment. Also, it's a fact. It's a fact that Lazarus was raised from the dead, and people at that time could see him, touch him, and talk to him, and question him. And that
Right.
was not mentioned. I mean, you have to go to some other sources, and I'm sure he probably was a witness of Jesus' crucifixion.
Right.
And so that I think is a very interesting element, So I wanted to ask if you, in your research, if you have come across a discussion on that.
Well, I guess, sorry, go ahead. Someone's commenting here, I think. Well, anyway, I was just going to say N.T. Wright is probably the place I would point you to. And I think that he has probably spent more time considering questions like this than anybody at this point. And he has quite a bit of discussion about the psychology of people who wanted to deny the resurrection. And one of the main takeaways of the book, at least as I read it, was he does a very thorough job. He's the book is a long book, and honestly, it's easy to get lost in details. But one of the points he does successfully make, I think, is that the notion of resurrection, as we think of it today, was a very alien idea at the time of Jesus. People stayed dead, and the only hope of a resurrection was at the end of time. The idea that someone was going to be physically raised, and the story of Lazarus was probably just mind-boggling to people, and probably very, very hard for people to accept. That was just not supposed to happen, and that was kind of the point. Jesus was trying to show he was God. So this was an amazing thing because people just did not. This was not part of their thinking at the time. And N.T. Wright does a very thorough job consulting a number of sources, not just the Bible, that point to this fact. It was almost always the case that people, death even in the Old Testament, was somewhere that you went and never came back from.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, let's move to John Cano.
Yes,
John.
thank you. Thank you for your presentation. My question's on number 4, the one about James, Jesus' brother,
Okay.
skeptic, and then he changed.
Yes.
Memory serves me right, the bullets you had underneath were within scripture. So is there any outside historians that substantiate that?
Yeah, I believe there is, and you might be right that I didn't include them. I'm was just kind of doing a overview, and I'm trying to go back to that slide to see what I actually just did. Okay, well, I didn't list it, but there is a graphic on the side that also mentions that there were people who wrote about him that were outside of the Bible. Apparently, I'm just looking at the slide right now. Apparently, Josephus even mentions him. Josephus was not a Christian. There was apparently a historian named Hegege, Hege, Hegesippus. I don't know how to pronounce this actually. Hegesippus maybe is the way it's pronounced, who apparently wrote about him. Clement of Alexandria wrote about him. There was early creeds that wrote about him. There was early church fathers that wrote about him. So I would, again, probably have to refer you to the book that I mentioned in the beginning. I certainly don't want to evade your question. It's a very important and honest question.
No, you've answered it. I mean, there were people outside of the
I believe
scriptures
the
that
answer is yes, and I just
okay.
may not be doing a terrific job of representing them right now, but I knew this would happen, which is why I wanted to have you plenty of books that you could go back to and take a look at.
Well,
Okay,
another
thank you.
thing, I'm sorry, but another thing that I don't remember that you were talking about, Doug, but is the fact that there are certain books in the New Testament that even the skeptics agree are valid historical documents, even though they might not believe the stories that are in them. But they, especially since they were written very close to the source, and by people who knew the individuals, that they would have some validity even to skeptics.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. There are people who are historians that, I mean, the Jesus Seminar is probably the most famous example of that, where they reject, frankly, a large part of the New Testament, but there are bits that they do accept as historical. The interesting thing is that there are also gospels, if you want to call them that were never accepted into the canon. In fact, if you ever bother to read them, you can sort of, obviously, you don't have to be a super duper. Go look up the Gospel of Thomas in on the internet and read that. And honestly, if you think that is serious literature, I honestly not sure you're a serious scholar. It is just not, it's just serious. I mean, people some of this stuff reads just like idiocy, and so even in translation, I don't think you have to be a scholar of Gnostic texts to think that the Gospel of Thomas might be very suspicious. But nevertheless, people do take these texts and use them and find within them historical data. It's not like you have to just totally reject them. Even in the Gospel of Thomas, he's acknowledging that Jesus existed, even if he's got a very bizarre version of him. This is the book where people are Jesus is being quoted as saying that if you manage to turn a woman into a man, that they can be saved thereby, and goofy stuff like that. But nevertheless, there are claims made in there that can be used to support a historical argument. And even there's also the Gospel of Peter, which again reads very bizarrely. There's a scene in there where they, I think the tomb is opened, and then there's this literally a talking cross that emerges from the tomb and just rises above everything and says these amazing things and whatnot. But the fact that they have to make these stories up is telling you something. There's a historical kernel there that it's the job of historians to identify, and that is that the Gospel of Peter was trying to explain something that was really bothering people. They just had a goofy way of doing it that is, in hindsight, is very poorly advised. But there's a lot of sources out there, including Gnostic texts, that probably can be used in a historical context to establish certain facts, and people do that. This is where I would point you to Lacona and Wright and others as well. I think even William Lane Craig. I haven't had a chance to read his book, but I'm told that's also an excellent source on that as well.
Okay, I see Marina George has her hand up. So Marina, go ahead.
Hi, Marina.
Hi, everyone. Yes, thank you, Doug. That was an excellent presentation. That was really awesome. Yes, I just wanted to share. So I'm taking a biblical archaeology class through Besora Institute, and yesterday actually we were just learning about the Nazareth inscription. I'm not sure if you've heard about it, but it was acquired in 1878 in Nazareth, and it's basically a tablet with Greek inscription forbidding under penalty of death the robbing of bodies from tombs. And it dates back to the first century AD, very likely written during the reign of Claudius. So I thought that was just an also interesting piece of archaeological evidence that can also point to the resurrection of the Lord. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts about that or if you've heard about that discovery.
Well, Marina, I haven't heard specifically about that issue. I will say that in New Testament times, I think there's good reason, especially in the case of Jesus, to think that people just didn't waltz up to a tomb and walk off the body anytime they pleased. This was a pretty serious thing. People had respect for the dead. So what you're suggesting sounds very plausible. but I don't know enough about the specific inscription to know what to say about it. But the guards of the tomb were supposed to be Roman soldiers who were, these guys were trained killers, and it wasn't like people could just sort of waltz up to the tomb and walk off with a body. It was a bit more than that. So
Yes.
interesting that you'd mentioned that.
Okay, anybody else? Any other questions for Doug while we got him here? Don't miss out here, because we won't have him tomorrow. Although I guess he'd be around if we had a question, but
well, yeah, I'm not dead yet. So
so
anyway,
so if nobody else has a question, I do. One of the
we had one.
Oh,
Sabina
well, go
had
ahead,
one.
Kirk.
I just
or
wanted to say
Sabina.
a quick thank you. It was very good, Doug, and we have some dear friends who I wish we could review some of this with, and perhaps one day we will. Pray for them. Thank you very much, and over to you, Kirby, and others.
let me make a comment about that, if I may. Just a thought to think about is that when, I just gave you a data dump, which I frankly enjoy doing, but I have to say that if you're dealing with a skeptic, that's probably exactly the wrong thing to do. I think the first thing you need to do is think about questions. And with this friend of yours or relative or family member, I'm not sure who that was, but you might want to take the approach, well, I was confronted with this information. I know that you're a bit skeptical. Can you help me review this? And I'd like to get your opinion about it. The old Columbo tactic, if you're familiar with that book. And just ask questions. Ask them, what do they think? How do they get to that conclusion? And see where it goes, and just let the conversation roll. But what I did tonight, as far as defending the resurrection, I think we have, as Christians, need to go through what I just went through. But if you're with a skeptic, a friend who is skeptical, the approach I just took tonight is probably exactly the wrong thing to do. You need to reduce what I've said into a series of questions that get them to think about the issues. And well, maybe I should stop there instead of going on, but I do have strong feelings about this kind of issue.
Yeah, good.
Okay, I was gonna raise one question, unless there's somebody else anybody can take precedence over my question. So
I had just one more question, Doug.
Go ahead, John.
Have you seen the recent movie called After Death that's going around in the movie theaters? And if so, I wonder if you'd like to comment on it. It's based on a documentary.
So I have not yet seen it. I'm honestly kind of buried personally. My wife wants to go back to visit her family in Taiwan, and I'm trying to finish a course at Biola early so I can do that. And I barely have time to breathe. But I know what you're talking about. And I have to say that Gary Habermas is, again, the guy on this kind of stuff. And I'd say next, other than the resurrection, the next thing he's famous for is after-death experiences. In fact, he's got a major book that I think he just recently published on this issue.
That's good to know.
And it's well worth reading, where he tries to document. He basically just gives lots of basically how I'm struggling for the words right now. I wanted to say stories, but they're really not stories. Basically, examples of cases, probably I should say, that are well attested. People who were in the operating room and supposedly medically died, and when they wake up, they talk about tennis shoes of a certain color, arranged in a certain way on the roof of the hospital. And it's not like there's one of these; there's like hundreds of them. And Gary Habermas is famous for collecting these things and assessing them. And I forgot the name of his book, but I believe he's got one out that I would recommend on these near-death experiences. I think this was a byproduct of his research into the resurrection, which is probably the thing he's most famous for. But I'm normally not a person who would like to go in that direction, but I have to say, the more I hear and the more I learn about this area, it seems like there's some very credible arguments from this perspective of testimonies of people who have had near-death experiences. And
so the book is out?
Well, maybe I can Google it, or someone can Google it while we're here. But basically, Gary Habermas, and then you might try Googling near death and see what you come up with.
Okay. All right.
I don't have the exact title, but my memory, which can be unreliable, is such that I believe he has, at least I know that he's, if you Google YouTube videos, I've definitely seen YouTube talks where he's talked about this, but I believe he's published book length treatments of it, and I think he has another one.
So, John, well, maybe you could be looking at for that while I'm asking my question. Well, my question basically was one of the minimal facts that you did not mention, and I may have an understanding of what you did not mention it, and that is that the Gospels tell us that there were some 500 people who attested to seeing Jesus after his resurrection, and that wasn't something you mentioned, and I was kind of curious as to, was that not considered one of the minimal facts?
I think he did have the appearances there.
I think the appearances are well attested to. I probably didn't explicitly mention the 500. That is mentioned in Corinthians, that I mentioned, I think, at the beginning of the talk, that
Right.
500 people did see them. But so I would have to say that the minimal facts approaches, there's a lot of ways to slice and dice this. And the number, I think in Habermas's 1975 or whatever the heck it was, thesis, the name, one of the slides I had up had the date. I think in his thesis, he came up with 12, but in later publications, he kind of whittled it down to 5 or 6. And then there are people who've gone to 3. And you can have a fun discussion about which ones you want to use. If you're in a situation where time is likely to be a problem, you probably want to have the least number. But at that, the only reason I might have not emphasized that is simply because I didn't have a huge amount of time, and some things probably got dropped off from the list. But Kirby, you're correct. That's a valid point.
Well, it may have been that
there
were less than 70% that of skeptics that went for it.
Well,
I don't know. I mean,
I think that one of my points, though, was that he did appear to Paul and to James.
Well, to the disciples, you definitely said that he appeared to the 12 disciples, but
okay, yeah, I guess that would be part of the evidence for that would be the 500 mentioned in Corinthians. But there's always more that you could emphasize in a talk like this.
Yeah,
it's just,
right.
As I said, Gary Habermas is coming out with a book in January, I believe, that will be it's going to be a multi-volume set. And the first book is coming out, I believe, in January on the issue of the resurrection. It's going to be 1,000 pages long.
Wow.
And his whole project, multi-volume project, will probably be more than 5,000 pages when he's done. It's like his magnum opus. This is the sum total of my life. Really, he's been studying this for his entire life. Mm-hmm. So he's got just tons and tons and tons of stuff. So, if I don't know if I'm going to ever get through it. It's something I would aspirationally love to read, but it's going to be a commitment to get through all that. And the amount of material, it's like we're living in this just river of information on this topic. And I'm trying to get through as much of it as I can because I want to know. And it's a challenge. But this is not a topic where people haven't weighed in a scholarly, extensive book length level. So there's plenty there for you to react to and think about if you really want that level of detail.
Okay, so any last minute questions?
One last minute comment.
Go ahead, Lothar.
I Googled that real quickly, and you find a 50-minute YouTube video with Habermas. And it says over 300 evidenced near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm. So but you don't have a title for the book?
I do. I found there's several books he's written, but I found this one. I hope it's the recent one. It's called Immortality, The Other Side of Death. It's on Amazon.
By Habermas?
By Gary Habermas, yes.
Yeah, okay.
That's got to be it. We heard this a few years ago. So I would take the same approach as Doug, that I would basically be very skeptical of these claims. And I was very skeptical. But then a friend of ours, Walter Bradley, you might know Bradley Thaxton, and I forget what it is. They wrote a book on Mystery of Life's Origins, but he was one of the first. Walter Bradley was one of the first guys to really point out the problems with origin of life, and one of the early ID guys, really. But anyway, he gave a talk a few years ago on near-death experiences that Sabina went to, and she found it quite convincing.
It was at the Evangelical Theological Society.
No, I think it was at ASA, or I mean, it was an ASA talk.
Well, maybe it was, but the room was packed.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was an ASA talk. It might have been the one at Baylor. Rodney, you might have been there too. But
I was not at Baylor, so
you weren't at Baylor. Okay, then it wasn't at that one.
I wasn't around that.
That was before Sabina.
No, just explaining, giving information.
Yeah. So anyway, but I talked with Walter a little bit, and what was one? It was in Boston. My love, it was
okay. That's fair.
Dinner thing in Boston. Anyway, but I talked with Walter a bit, and he's very convinced.
And it was similar stories to what you just shared, Doug, about Gary Habermas saying, someone who was being operated on, and they were, I don't know, I think declared dead, and then they came back and were talking about stuff
things happen.
No, stuff that was on top of the cabinets, or on the roof of a neighboring building or something like that.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm open to the idea, but
there's one story I heard where somebody was in a hospital and had a near death and died on the operating table medically, and then they were aware, or somehow, this was in Chicago area, I think, if I remember right, and they were somehow able to witness events happening, but with relatives in Florida, of all things. So then there was one instance which is kind of somehow amusing to me. It stuck in my mind, at least, about some people who had medically died, and then the relatives were talking about them in ways that were probably not so flattering. And the person woke up and recounted the entire conversation. So be careful what you say about the death.
You're right.
So, I say that.
Okay.
There's an element of truth to that, as well as a little bit of element of attempted humor on my part. But anyway, these stories get interesting.
Yeah, many years ago, I actually met a gentleman in a Bible study that actually experienced a near-death experience. And that was the first time I heard anything like that. And because of that testimony and his part, it triggered my interest in following up this particular topic.
Yeah. I think this is one of those cases where you're going to need a lot of data to be convinced. Because, there's a lot of people who have UFO encounters too. There's a long list of that was mentioned earlier tonight. And it's true that you can find there's the Betty and Barney Hill story. I remember reading that in high school because I was curious. A very convincing story about a couple who was supposedly taken up in a flying saucer and were medically studied and all this stuff. And they found this all out by hypnotizing them. And of course, they were not very willing to they were very traumatized by it. Anyway, you could argue that was kind of convincing, actually. But, I'm not sure that, if you apply a minimal facts argument to that it holds up, because of issues of physics and issues of other things that have to be explained by that model that just are not well explained.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm probably rambling here, but that's I don't want to dismiss near-death experiences, but I think the comment made earlier by Kirk is correct. You should hold those a bit loosely, I think, and try to. There's plenty of other really more well-substantiated facts that might be better to go with a skeptic on than that. But it depends on the person's situation, and I wouldn't discount them. So, sorry if there's someone who wanted to make a comment, I overspoke there.
Well, Doug, I think this has been a great talk. I really appreciate your willingness to speak to us, and I think that all of us have taken away a lot of good information. And so really want to thank you for just taking the time to spend with us and to give us this presentation. And I wonder if I might ask you to close our meeting in a word of prayer.
Sure. Father God, I'm just so impressed with how the resurrection made such an impact on people in the time of Jesus. It was probably the only thing that can really explain the creation, if you will, or of the church. There really is no other way to explain how the church would begin without a resurrected Jesus. Father, thank you that you have you want to interact with us through not only our heart, our soul, but also through our mind. And we have a faith that also is intended to interact with evidence, that we are supposed to be thinking both with our head as well as with our heart, and that we are perfectly legitimately encouraged to look at the evidence. And I just pray that tonight that we would do that we'd be encouraged personally, and that we would be equipped to be able to share these things in some way that's winsome and effective with others who might have questions. So there's so much so-called deconstruction going on right now, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that people just haven't thought through their faith in a way that makes them less likely to be having the doubts that they do. In the name of your Son, we just want to thank you for the opportunity and the privilege to be your servants. Amen.
Amen. Thanks
Thank you.
again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.